Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Toro, a royal battle from the War of the Castilian Succession fought on March the 1st, 1476, near the city of Toro, between the Castilian Aragonese troops of the Catholic monarchs and the Portuguese Castilian forces of Alonso V and Prince John of Portugal. So, today, as always, for the battle video, we will make a tactical analysis of the clash, leaving aside the important strategic but also especially political context of the battle. The Battle of Toro had an inconclusive military outcome. Both sides claimed victory, was fought in, as we will see now, in peculiar conditions, especially from an atmospheric point of view and time of the day. The Castilian right wing was defeated by the forces under Prince John, who possessed the battlefield, but the troops of Alfonso V were beaten by the Castilian left center, led by the Duke of Alba and Cardinal Mendoza. However, the battle was a major political victory for the Catholic monarchs by assuring to Isabella the throne of Castile. So this led fundamentally to the unification of Spain under the Catholic monarchs, and prevented a different dynastic union between Portugal and Castile. The remnants of the nobles loyal to Juana de Trastamara adhered to Isabella. That's what, as we will see now, the problem was fundamentally that the last king of Castile was Isabella's half brother, had died. His wife with his daughter had been married to the king of Portugal, and she was actually his niece, and this gave birth to the War of Castilian Succession. The war continued, in fact, until the Peace of Alcazovas, 1479, and the official propaganda transformed the Battle of Toro into a victory, which avenged, by the way, the Battle of Aljubarrota that was fought in the previous century, and that had been a Castilian defeat by the hands of the Portuguese that had ensured, through the victory, their independence as a sovereign kingdom. So this battle is interesting for a number of factors. The first one that we have already addressed briefly are, the fact that basically both sides claim victory. That there is a general coincidence of all the battle accounts, but both from the Castilian and the Portuguese side, or those sources that were kind of pro-Portuguese in general, but still Spanish. And there are other problems that are a bit more difficult to solve regarding the certain, if you want, details that do not change the dynamic of the battle, but that present a few obscure points. So first of all, this has much to do with the battlefield. This is a battle for which I managed to, so late medieval times, there is actually plenty of sources that we should study all one by one. So in order to make a video every day or every 2 days about a battle like this, there is no time really to study properly them all. And usually on the internet you don't find much of an explicit collection of these sources, and oddly enough, in this case, Wikipedia does. I've checked, as I often do, the battle on the English Wikipedia to assess fundamentally what's this all about. Is there some extra information? Is there some interesting bibliographical reference? And I was pleased to see that, in fact, there is a thorough, satisfactory quotation from all the major accounts of the battle regarding all the various phases of the battle. So that's great. It's usually something you don't see on the Wikipedia articles, and I checked, in fact, the Spanish original, and in fact it's in there that all these accounts were in there. There is actually more than that. Frankly, I can read Spanish, not everything fully, but on the English article there is a good summary of the whole thing, except one that is actually crucial for any tactical analysis. That is the battlefield proper. And I think one of the main problems is that we don't know cent for cent where the battle took place. Like, we have a general idea that it was fought in the plain between Toro and Pelea Gonzalo, which is a village just downstream in the Duero River. We'll see that basically the two armies were, actually the Castilian one were running after the Portuguese. I will be keeping saying Portuguese, but as we will see now, that they were fundamentally Portuguese Castilians, because this was a Castilian civil war. There were Spanish troops also from the Portuguese side. But fundamentally, the Portuguese army was retreating upstream along the left bank of the Duero River. Going upstream, it's the right bank, but and the Castilian force from Zamora that had been previously besieged by the Portuguese army had now sailed forth and reached the same Portuguese in this area, right, in this plain. And I've checked today, there is even a monument to Isabel in the crossroad that you see here, close to where you see the name Bodega Divina, right, close to Toro. However, the battle seemingly was fought something like 5 miles downstream from Toro. In fact, I've seen online there were people that were, photographing here this panoramic view from when you see here Toro de Santa Maria la Mayor here. You can easily see on the relief this kind of steep bank that falls in the Duero, right? And many people, I don't know, at least those ones thought that the battle was fought there, but simply, there is no room for deploying any army there, clearly, as there is not also on the other side of the bank. So actually, we are pretty sure that the battle was fought downstream on the left bank. And for some reason that I haven't fully understood from the sources, because I haven't found the specific reference about this, about any topographical reference of where the battle was fought in this broader area, in this narrower area, right? But it's assumed to have been fought in this village you see in the south here, named Pelea Gonzalo. That I think that Pelea in Spanish is battle, so I presume that it's even named, it's possibly connected to the battle itself, but I just don't know. And other sources tell fundamentally that the Castilians were pursuing the Portuguese, passing in fact, a pass proper. That is the one that you can see here on the left of the map. You see the reliefs west of Pelea Gonzalo that go towards the north and arrive at this choke point on the Duero River, right? And I presume that was the pass that at some point it's named, from which the Castilians arrived from the west, and they deployed in this plain, which is a pretty good area for a pitched battle, actually, and fought against the Portuguese. Now, there are a bunch of information say that, for example, the Portuguese deployed with the back on the Duero, so that would change the axis of 90 degrees of the battle line. So that's where some question arose about, but are we really sure where this was really fought, etc. But as we will see in the battle, it kind of makes sense that objectively, the battle line was running approximately in this axis north-south, right? And simply the Castilians were coming from the west. The Portuguese were also coming from the west, but they were reached, and now turning to the west themselves against the Castilian army. This battle was fought before sunset, some hours, I think, before sunset. By that time of the year, that latitude is at 7.101 p.m., right? So it's fairly early, and the battle was effectively concluded when the night fell. So that's kind of typical, and we'll see now all the controversies about how the whole thing went. Wu held the battle because seemingly, at least for Wu wrote this article that pointed all these aspects from the sources. A major problem of the battle, it was determining who actually won from a tactical point of view, because eventually the outcome was exploited beautifully by Isabella from a political point of view to declare it was a major Castilian victory, and she managed to secure the throne for her daughter. Famously enough, the Juana herself, she was named also as the other contendant to the throne, and the one who would marry the Habsburg and starting the Habsburgs of Spain herself. But what happened on the battlefield suggests different things. This was definitely not a crushing Castilian victory, was not a crushing Portuguese victory either, but at least the Portuguese, as we will see now, were the last to abandon the field, when the Castilians basically retreated during the night, so that the day after, the Prince of Portugal stood basically alone on the field, but even there they basically kept retreating their own way, and as we were saying before, we will not analyze the consequences of it. It's a purely tactical analysis, but it's still important to bear in mind the general picture that we will try to, that is important, if anything, to understand what the armies were doing, right? Because it's not just a tactical analysis, is not just about where the armies were standing when they fought, but who had the initiative. In this case, it's fascinating that the same Castilian army that had been besieged in Zamora by the Portuguese ran after for long march, by the way, because it's several kilometers, tens of kilometers actually from Zamora, and it's just to attack eventually before night fell, so that these armies were anxious evidently, and the Portuguese could simply proceed on in a way, but it would have been risky, but they gave battle anyway. So there was this seemingly tail strike from the Castilians that were counting on inflicting some losses on the Portuguese, but still giving battle, maybe because they were forced by the same time, or maybe because they just wanted to try to inflict some losses and trying eventually to retreat in the night had things gone wrong in a way. And we will see that the Castilian army was actually commanded by Ferdinand of Aragon, right? So Isabel's husband, and as the Reyes Católicos famously were, to win this war of Castilian succession and unify Castilian Aragon in a dynastic sense. So there are certain aspects that I presume I should read the entirety of the sources to understand better, and that would require much longer time. So I'm sure that I've searched for some articles, etc. This is an important battle that seemingly has been studied mostly, as always, it often happens a bit all over Western historiographies because of the great meaning, right, of the political consequences. But from a tactical point of view, I haven't found this much. I must say that also in strictly tactical terms, it's nothing glamorous, right? It was a somewhat typical battle of the late medieval Iberian warfare without much of an exception. It's just fascinating how it went, because it was pretty messed up, telling the truth. And it brought this style standstill that towards the end was brought to the same end of the battle. But it's still fascinating to try to understand the dynamics better. There is some interesting use of cavalry, arquebuses, and so on, and we'll see now. So, as we were saying before, basically the death of Henry IV of Castile in 1474 had led to the succession crisis and the formation of two rival parties. Isabella, king's half-sister, received the support of the majority of the Castilian noblemen, clerics, and people, whereas Juana de Trastámara, the king's daughter, was supported by some powerful nobles. And this rivalry degenerated in a civil war, and the Portuguese king Alfonso V intervened in the defense of his niece Juana's rights, to whom he married. He tried to unify the crowns of Castile and Portugal as an alternative to the union of Castile with Aragon, personified by the marriage of Isabella to Ferdinand, the heir of Aragon's throne. And that at this time was still heir, actually. Yes, before I said king, but he would become king from 1479. So just minor correction. So looking at the campaign fundamentally. So after some skirmishes, Alfonso V's army marched for the rescue of the besieged castle inside Burgos. Right, it was one of the major Castilian cities. And on the way at Baltanas, the Portuguese defeated and imprisoned a force of 400 spearmen of the Count of Benavente, and also took Cantalapiedra, reaching the distance of only 60 kilometers from Burgos. At this point, the Castilian allies pressed Alfonso V to advance south towards Madrid, where they assured him many supporters. The king, who did not want to stretch his communication lines with Portugal, didn't listen to them and withdrew, leaving Burgos to its fate. Right, this was apparently an important political mistake, because the city, first of all, just from a strategic point of view, surrendered on January the 28th, 1476, and the Portuguese king prestige sank among the Castilians, and it is the turning point of the war. Ocaña and other places changed sides, the Estuniga family defected, the mighty Marquis of Villena, Diego López Pacheco, denied his military support, and the Juanista band began its dissolution. And here we go to get to Zamora and the prelude of the Battle of Toro, because Alfonso V preferred this point to secure its line of cities and strongholds along the Duero River, right? So here we are from the left part of Spain towards Portugal. But on December 4th, 1475, a part of Zamora's garrison, there was a key Juanista city, rebelled and besieged the inner fortress where the Portuguese took refuge. At this point, Ferdinand II of Aragon entered the city the next day. Right, it was occupied. And at the end of January 1476, Alfonso V received the reinforcement troops led by his own son, the perfect prince, John II, as he would become John II as King of Portugal from eventually 1481 to his death in 1495. And in the middle of February 1476, the combined Portuguese forces besieged Ferdinand's army locked inside the city of Zamora, right? Putting him in the curious situation of besieger being besieged. This is actually frequent in medieval warfare, like, inside the cities there were, the citadels that were besieged from within the city. Then someone came to relieve the citadel by besieging the city, right? That in turn had to be defended by the besiegers of the citadel. So this is actually not very, very uncommon, telling the truth. And this is winter, right? And the area is not that warm. And after 2 cold and rainy weeks, the besiegers decided to leave and rest in the city of Toro, right? That is upstream the Duero River, as we've seen, towards the east. So the Portuguese basically retreat from the siege of Zamora. They go past by it, and Ferdinand pursued and reached them near Toro, where both armies decided to engage in battle. Right. So, and here where Wikipedia doesn't actually specify how where the two armies actually entered in contact, right? Because the choke point that we observed before on the map is an important pass, right? That first of all can be crossed just not by the whole army arrayed along to the battle line. In fact, as far as I understood, the sources of the battle even have this sort of apparent discrepancy, talking about often the vanguard, the rearguard in this initial phase of the deployment, because they passed from column to line in one or another. So certain parts of eventually we will see the center and the respective wings were still deployed in the march order and before. But the important thing is that it's kind of chivalric and was done once pitched battles were negotiated fundamentally, that the Portuguese left the Castilians deploy, right? Whereas they might have attacked them, I don't know, while they were still passing the crossing the pass, so in an extremely vulnerable situation. So I haven't been able to find information at this point, and partly because probably we don't know exactly how the thing folded. Where, for example, the Portuguese were marching their own way, so at some point they, deciding to eventually stop the march and deploying for battle. Given that night was close, right? It wasn't such an easy decision, right? Because still it entailed the major risk. Now these were basically the major armies involved in the campaign. So literally this battle, as we have seen, tactically speaking, didn't apparently change much. And I would have a bit of saying about this later, because frankly, the political consequences were important, possibly for some aspects, that took place on the battle, namely the losses among actually the best of the nobility of the Portuguese line. So something might have happened. We will see it later, but we don't know exactly, whether the Castilians, for example, managed to deploy before the Portuguese, were deployed for combat themselves. So there is a bit of blank space in here, but I presume at least that they deliberately decided to, through messengers, to give battle, and they deployed accordingly, right? Which shows a high determination from both sides, right? Or at least, the Castilians now were essentially exposing themselves, running after the enemy army that had just besieged them for 2 weeks, and risking the whole thing, even for some reasons that now were pressing them to stop the Portuguese advance in Castile. From the Portuguese side, they were confident enough that at least their forces were capable of winning a battle over, getting a victory over the Castilians. Now let's give a look, in fact, at the size of the armies, because they were fairly balanced, right? Both armies had similar number of men, around 8,000 soldiers. There are other estimates that are higher, but it seems that that these were realistically the sizes. And according to Bernal, that is the only chronicler who gives the total numbers. So this is also interesting. The Portuguese had 8,500 men, including 3,500 cavalry and 5,000 infantry, while Ferdinand's army had 7,500 men, of whom 2,500 cavalry and 5,000 infantry. Right, at least when he left, when the Castilians left Zamora. This is important because it seems like the Castilians literally hurried up, and there is evidence during the battle of Castilian reinforcements joining, reaching the field while the engagement had already began, and this seemingly included the infantry that was slower, but also the artillery. So basically, the Castilians gave battle, even with consistent less numbers that probably they had when they left Zamora. Also, if you look from these numbers, the Portuguese army had a light advantage of 1,000 horsemen. Actually, it's not that light. It's a lot, and we will see now that the Portuguese cavalry carried out pretty good feats, especially on their left flank. And Bernal that's also wrote that the Portuguese army who besieged Zamora had 8,500 men. The siege of this city, as we have seen, had started in the middle of February, lasting 2 weeks, and after the union of the reinforcements brought by the perfect France with the royal army of Alfonso V at the end of January, and continued until the day of the battle, so the same March the 1st. So 8,500 men is the total number for the combined Portuguese forces at the Battle of Toro. Since the Portuguese army thought it was precisely the army who abandoned the Zamora siege and withdrew to Toro, right, where it was reached by the former besieged Isabelist army. But from this initial number of 8,500 men, it is necessary to discount the losses by desertion, disease, and fight during Zamora's siege, during 15 days of hard winter. So it's likely that the Portuguese Castilians were 8,000. Also, from the Portuguese side, this number reflects the high desertion that the army had already suffered since the beginning of the campaign, because the Portuguese had probably began the invasion with 14,000 infantry and 5,600 knights, allegedly, which is a plausible number. And many of them had been used as garrison of strongholds and thus did not fight the Battle of Toro. And especially after the failure of Burgos, as we have seen, as it is told by Rui de Pina, that as we'll see now, it's another chronicler, quote, many Portuguese without the will of serving the king came back to the kingdom of Portugal. The Portuguese captains complained that while they were in Castile, the undefended lands in Portugal were set on fire and looting by the enemy. Other reasons were the high losses by disease, especially fevers from the hot, and also because of the Portuguese Castilian army included many Castilian contingents who easily and massively changed sides after the aborted expedition to Burgos and its consequent fall on January the 28th. From all the great Castilian nobles who initially supported Juana, only the Archbishop of Toledo, Alfonso Carrillo de Acuña, was at the side of Alfonso V on the day of the battle. And after all, despite the reinforcement troops brought by the Prince John, when the Battle of Toro was fought, the invader army had suffered the erosion of 10 months of permanency in enemy territory. Also, Álvaro López de Chaves, most nationalist of the Portuguese chroniclers, wrote that the Castilian army had a small advantage of 700 to 800 cavalry over the Portuguese army. So that is somewhat realistic, given the data here. And Pulgar corroborates. There's another chronicle corroborates the similar size of both armies. There was little difference in the number of horsemen between both armies, but still, even if there was, the high numbers involving dozens of thousands of men in each army, as it is mentioned in some modern records of the Battle of Toro, not only do not have documentary support, but are also in direct contradiction with the historical record. The contemporaneous chronicler Andreas Bernaldez, being a Castilian and a partisan of the Catholic monarchs, cannot therefore be accused of pulling down the numbers of the armies present at the battlefield to reduce the triumph of his king Ferdinand at Toro. Bernaldez is also corroborated by the partial numbers of the late chronicler Zurita, that was a Spanish historian of the 16th century, for the horsemen of both armies, 3,000 cavalry to Ferdinand and 3,500 cavalry to Alfonso V. Right. So basically, the armies were fundamentally equal, and also in composition, presumably. About this we know less, but fundamentally, the Iberian armies were homogeneous at this point. And with the Portuguese having a slight advantage, numerical advantage in cavalry, right? So let's give a look to the disposition of the forces and how properly the armies were arrayed. So the Isabelist army under Ferdinand of Aragon. So the center was commanded by Ferdinand himself. It included the royal guard and forces of several hidalgos, right? The nobility, the Iberian nobility, like the Count of Lemos and the Mayordomo Mayor, so the majordom, that technically would be Enrique Enriquez. And it was formed mainly by popular militias of several cities like Zamora, Ciudad Rodrigo, and Valladolid. Right, so this was composed as basically all the, at least his main battles were composed by cavalry and a reserve of infantry. Then the right wing had 6 divisions, known in the sources as batallas, or battles, of light cavalry, or jinetes, right? So this light cavalry intended as to traditionally as skirmishers, but probably here we were composed in a more segmented fashion, commanded by their captains, Álvaro de Mendoza, who was the main captain, the Bishop of Avila, and Alfonso de Fonseca. These two men shared the command of one battle. Right? As we will see, they will take action accordingly. And Pedro de Guzman, Bernal Frances, Vasco de Vivero, and Pedro de Velasco as well. As we were saying before, this wing is sometimes called vanguard by the sources, as some of his men closely followed the Portuguese from Zamora to Toro. Right, so they had been the path openers that had harassed the Portuguese during the march and informed naturally the rest of their army of their movements. Right, so both sides were at this point, I understand, aware of the position of the enemy throughout all the whole day of the march. So the Portuguese at this point realized they had enough time to have at least foreseen and pre-planned the eventual redeployment for battle, right? And it is possible, actually, at this very point, that the Portuguese might have been chivalric enough to cross that pass and to deploy in the plain beyond, to waiting for the Castilians at that point. This is interesting because it still happened at night. The choke point might have been actually the strategical reason for this decision, because had the battle been fought before it, troops would have had a much more difficult time to run away in that regard, even though they could have escaped on the mountains, which is something that actually happened, as we will say, in part during the same battle, but at least it would have still obliged the Castilians to, because there is an open plain from the other side, so also for pursuing, as we will see, it caused some problem. But the Castilians from the other side they were fighting basically with this choke point at their back. So they possibly the Portuguese decided, in fact, likely at this point, the very spot of battle exactly for trying to bottle up the Castilians, and in case of victory to kill and taking them prisoners more easily. Right, and this right wing of the Castilian army of the Jinetes was divided in two lines, 5 battles at the forefront and 1 in the rear. Right, so this is the line formation. The left wing was instead composed by many knights with heavy armor, divided in 3 corps. The left one, near the Portuguese, commanded by Admiral Enriquez, the center one led by Cardinal Mendoza, and on the right the force headed by the Duke of Alba. It was the most powerful, as we will see, and for the Portuguese it would be the same, that their left wing was also the strongest. The Castilians also had reserve forces, the men of Enrique Enriquez, Count of Alba de Aliste, that was King Ferdinand's uncle and Galicia's governor, who would be taken prisoner by the Portuguese during battle, and the horsemen from the Marquis of Astorga. The foot soldiers were in the middle of all those battles. In practical terms, the Sabelist army fought on 2 separate fronts, right wing and left center, royal battle, due to the presence of Ferdinand. This might have been true. This thing of the foot soldiers station actually in the front line is fascinating. Once again, I haven't read it explicitly from the sources, but it reflects a tactic that possibly at this point, given that the various chunks of the army were spaced in one or another, and I presume actually here, given the development of the battle, it seems like respectively at least talking about the Castilians, like the left center were something on their own, while they were detached from the right wing, but possibly they were actually 3 separated chunks with infantry maybe on their wings. So I like at least to see it in this way, with possibly also other infantry in the rear of the cavalry as well, right? So, but also about the development of the battle, this is the important thing. We don't have an enormous evidence of how eventually things went, right? This is not like we have a scientific idea of how the battle was fought, right? Even if we know how how these troops were deployed before, it doesn't seem that, after all, they made much of a difference, in the sense that infantry, as by grown in importance in this period, was, as we will partially see also with the arquebusiers, for example, that appear, they were surely in the front line at some point, and that's why it's mostly those specialistic troops that had the greater impact. But the masses of the peons, right, of the infantry, mounted foot soldiers, probably didn't constitute much of a solid front line, so maybe they were stationed in the rear for both armies. But let's see. The composition of Portuguese Castilian army of Alfonso V and the Perfect Prince was instead composed like this. The center, commanded by Alfonso V, was formed by the knights of several noblemen from his house and the Castilian knights loyal to Dona Juana, led by Rui Pereira. It also had 4 bodies of footmen with their backs turned to the Duero River. This is what I was talking about before, about the fact, if it had 4 bodies of footmen with their backs turned to the Duero River, what's the sense of this? You don't have them aligned with the line of battle. They're apparently 90 degrees. What are they doing there? Are they maybe shielding the flank from one side? They do have to attack the enemy when they will from the rear, from the flank during the I don't know. I don't know whether this is representative of that specific maneuver, or this is meant instead of saying some of their troops, some part of this center actually was with the bank, with the river bank at their backs, and actually this is the center. So what about the right wing? That's where they should have been stationed if they had their in that perpendicular way their backs turned to the river. So this is what I haven't fully understood. I've been toying around with this battlefield, and frankly, it doesn't seem to be any evidence of further development of the battle along this line in many ways. So I don't really know. If you look at the river, it basically remained, the riverbed remained like it was at the time. The line is pretty straight, and armies generally always fought in part with this long battlefields in parallel to the river and a mountain ridge in this case. So it's the typical deployment, and I don't understand this perpendicular position of troops with their backs on the river, and especially from the center of the army. So this would suggest that at least the center was wheeled like 90 degrees itself. That the maybe Portuguese army was with its back on the river, but there's no evidence of this, and especially no reason for deploying like that. Also, as we will see later, the same dynamic of the battle suggests that properly the army was closer to the Portuguese army was closer to the mountain ridge here in the south. So this information, I don't know where it's taken from because it's not sourced, and that's why you should study like the wall sources before starting analyzing a battle in this regard. But for the rest, it seems all pretty. There is a pattern that is normally logical, that always replicates itself albeit with minor differences in warfare. And I've studied my share of medieval battles, I can tell you up to this point, and frankly I don't see any comparable pattern in that regard for this tiny, by the way, element of infantry that doesn't seem to have accomplished particularly much, apparently. Also because the center, the Portuguese center would crumble, frankly. So, but anyhow, let's leave it like this. Then the right wing was made up of troops of Portuguese noblemen and also of Castilians of the Toledo's Archbishop Alfonso Carrillo. The left wing was made up by the elite troops of the Portuguese kingdom together with the army's artillery. That in this sense is meant to be actually here both arquebusiers and other artillery used during the siege eventually, and also javelin throwers. So the left wing here was a pretty well composed one, pretty tactically balanced one, and also containing the little of the army. In fact, it was commanded by the perfect prince, who, as we will see, would accomplish the most from the Portuguese side during the battle. Who also had his main captain, the Bishop of Évora, right, and it included a rear guard battle under Pedro de Menezes, right. So this is definitely the strongest part of the Portuguese army. And it seems here there is this note that says, basically, given how the battle went, it seems that this, as we were saying before, these two halves of the battle, that is to say, respectively, the right Castilian wing and the left Portuguese wing, it's as if they fought kind of a battle on their own from their side, while the rest, the Castilian left center and the Portuguese center right, fought their own. But this is kind of normal in the sense that here there is evidently a frontal attack. Every section from its own side goes its own way, so it's not that they move across diagonally or they make other interaction. It simply happened that the Portuguese left wing, as we all see, managed to break the Castilian right, and that's it. And the rest of the Castilian army instead managed to make the crumble the Portuguese formation they had in front of them. So the fact that these are dealt with like as two different chunks, my opinion could be simply, these were actually from all sides 3 different chunks, and they just have this relative outcome each on its own. But I'm not sure whether they, also the space, frankly, of the battlefield is not very large. Here you can see fundamentally from the map, looking at it, the width of the battlefield is not more than 2 kilometers, right? It's not very long, right? So naturally, yes, the battles could be substantially separated, that they needed room for maneuvering, but also I think that the battle line in general was fairly, given that this was not a deployment in depth. So when you have a unique line, unless they weren't deployed in echelon, which at this point, especially in late medieval warfare, didn't happen much because they tried to maximize just, the charge, the shock effect, the firepower altogether. So I think that after all, they were fairly close, or at least fairly inside, and leaving gaps in the line wasn't probably the best option in the first place. But in fact, let's see how the battle went. Oh, and by the way, about the visibility, which could support the idea that effectively, the various parts of the army fought on their own way, but still, this is all kind of a flat land, right? There are no major obstacles. If the time and weather had been different, probably they wouldn't have much trouble to see each other. But at least during the day, I presume they kind of managed to do it. And all the chroniclers on both sides agree that the battle began just before sunset, which on March the 1st, as we have seen, occurs around after 7 p.m. And the fight would have taken between more than an hour, according at least to Damião de Gois, as we all see, and far more than 3 hours. And this chronicler, referring only to the struggle between the both royal battles, wrote that the indecisiveness of the outcome lasted for 3 hours, which without victory leaning to either side. But to this we must add the time required for the prior defeat and chase of the Castilian right wing, the withdrawal of Alfonso V's men, and the pursuit of during the dark night into Toro. It was minus the 5 kilometers away. But in any case, here then everybody says its own thing. Here I read 5 kilometers. Before I read 5 miles. So the position here doesn't quite change much. The idea is that the battlefield is all pretty similar, as you see also from the map, right? There is no major difference both on the sides here, and more or less the distances are the same. I'm actually pretty confident it was fought, in fact, here at the height of Pelea Gonzalez, we've often said, which is actually 8 kilometers away. And I don't know, the area there I've seen it's all canalized now, but there were probably some small streams. It's possible one of the two that eventually flow into the Douro River. And it's possible that one, especially the Portuguese army, might have deployed behind one of these streams. Right, and as far as the right flank is concerned, that there is the Douro River, and on the left there is this ridge that, as we will see, it's likely the only area where eventually the Portuguese rallied at some point during the battle. But in fact, let's see the battle proper, because that's what we are here for. So, the forces of Prince John and the Bishop of Évora, that, as we've seen, were very well equipped. They had arquebusiers, javelin throwers, the Portuguese elite knights, and even other artillery, I presume, and infantry, attacked. The knights screamed, "St. George, St. George," as patron of knights. This was the kind of standard war cry of medieval nobility, right? All of these nobilities here were soaked into this extreme chivalric sense of elitism, of proud, of honor, and prestige, and so on. So they saw themselves in many ways as a class of their own. Knighthood for them was everything. In many ways, they were many noblemen, so they were extremely, that's what they needed to do: attacking, charging straight. And this is what they do. They invested the 6 bodies or battles in the right wing of the Castilian army that, as we have seen, were composed mostly by light cavalry instead, the jinetes. And the prince attacked the 5 advanced battles, while the battle of Pedro de Meneses, that, as we've seen, had been left in reserve, attacked the other one. Here we don't know. Frankly, here there is a note. This is from Gois, chapter 78, anyhow. And how did this happen, frankly, I don't know, because they were, from the opposite sides in depth of the formation. So, naturally, we have to imagine that, especially among cavalry units, the battle was quite dynamic. And how large were these battalions actually on the right? Because on the Castilian right, they may have been, I don't know, like a company size, like 100, 150 for each, right? And that's already kind of a large number. But splitting by 3, yes, it's possible. There were something like of the 3 chunks of the army. It's possible. Possibly there were even more. But so they presumably, I don't know, they began running around back and forth. There were other sources that we'll see now that actually tell that the Portuguese, before charging, began to pepper the Castilian right wing with arquebusiers, right, and threw them in disorder before the elite knights charged, right. And the Castilian forces, as we've seen, which were very select, withdrew in disorder and suffered heavy losses. And here, let's read directly some chronicler. There is Hernando de Pulgar, who was a Castilian, states, promptly those 6 Castilian captains, which we have already told, were at the right side of the royal battle, and were invested by the Prince of Portugal and the Bishop of Évora, turned their backs and put themselves on the run. Garcia de Resende, Portuguese, says, and being the battles of both sides ordered that way and prepared to attack by nearly sunshine, the king ordered the prince to attack the enemy with his and God's blessing. Here he says by nearly sunshine, so it's kind of telling the battle began at morning, but this is not the case. The king ordered the prince to attack the enemy with his and God's blessing, which he obeyed. And after the sound of the trumpets and screaming all for St. George, invested so bravely the enemy battles, and in spite of the enormous size, they could not stand the hard fight and were rapidly beaten and put on the run with great losses. The chronicler Pedro de Medina, Castilian. In the Portuguese left wing, where the people of the Prince of Portugal and from the Bishop of Évora were, a very cruel battle began in which the Castilians were defeated. Due to the large artillery and shotguns bullets from the enemy, a huge number of Castilians promptly fell dead, and was necessary to remove another crowd of wounded men. As for the remaining, they found a great resistance in the Portuguese, since this was their strongest army side, and as already told, and were forced to withdraw. Having been so easily defeated, the right battled the Castilian army, the other two their respective counterparts, in order to avenge the affront and losses. Right. So here's the source that talks about the preparatory softening up action of the Portuguese arquebusiers. Then Chronicler Juan de Mariana, so Castilian. The Castilian horsemen moved forward. So here he says that it was the Castilians fundamentally that attacked. It says they were received by Prince John, whose courage they couldn't stand, but were instead defeated and ran away. So you see that there are different versions of how the thing went, actually. For example, it's interesting that here the various sources here, that they don't even contradict each other depending on the nationality. It's simply they have a different way. Before it says that the arquebusiers, the Portuguese arquebusiers made so many losses that the Castilians had apparently to take away the dead from the ground, because they probably obstructed the path, I don't know. This other one says, that Castilian had moved forward and that evidently the Portuguese had countercharged. So I don't know, maybe the thing is explainable because Castilians stood under the enemy fire for a while, decided to attack before. We don't really know, right? This is just how reconstructions of battles happen, right? Unless every source states the same exact thing, at some point you can combine, but it's just the versions, but it's just hypothesis, and the accounts tend to conflict in some way. And then the Damião de Gois said, the Portuguese says, these Castilians who were on the right of the Castilian royal battle received the charge of the prince's men as brave knights invoking Santiago, but they couldn't resist them and began to flee, and so our men killed and arrested many of them, and among those who escaped some took refuge in the royal battle, which was on the left of these 6 Castilian divisions. So this is interesting because, once again, even a Portuguese chronicler states that the Castilians had charged, right? And as the Portuguese had cried St. George, the Castilians invoked St. James, as you know, the most important sanctuary in Spain, Santiago de Compostela. And so, once again, we don't know, and even these jinetes would have not necessarily been just skirmishers. They surely had some melee component by the default. I mean, not at least units that were just for skirmishing, preferably. And also, chronicler Garibay, that was a Spanish, says Alfonso de Fonseca first, and then Alvaro de Mendoza and other captains begged the King Ferdinand permission to be the first to attack the prince's squad, which was the strength of the Portuguese army, and the king authorized them, provided that the 6 battles named above remained together, and facing the prince's squads they were defeated, many of them dying due to artillery and javelin throwers, and this way the victory in the beginning was for their Portuguese. So altogether, actually, these accounts present a pretty homogeneous picture. I should point out that actually these accounts are from different times. Like, some are from the 15th century, some are from the 16th, also somewhat later in some generations. So they're not like to be, some probably quote each other. So I haven't done, once again, all the work of philology takes a lot of time. But there is no controversy about the fact that Prince John managed to break the Castilian right. And at this point, the prince's men pursued the fugitives along the lane. So as we've seen here, there is this big flat land, so that's an ideal ground actually to run after them. But at the same time, here consider the Castilians were all mounted, were even jinetes, so they were light horse and not so easy to pursue. Naturally, when you break an enemy unit, like, it's not that they perform in the same identical ways if they were fresh like in video games, right? These people are shocked and traumatized, and that they don't know what to do. Think about the chaos on the battlefield, the whole thing. So, but this was valid actually from the same Portuguese side, because after a charge, you have to rally, you have to reorder before you can attack from another side. This is a problem. And the prince was worried at this point so much that he ordered to avoid the dispersion of his troops and decided to make a halt. Because Garcia Resende says, and the prince, as a wise captain, seeing the great victory God had given to him and the good fate of that hour, chose to secure the honor of victory than to follow the chase. Right? This is also very important because, as we will see, the Portuguese will try to outflank the Castilians on their right. So that's a very good opportunity. I mean, your whole right wing is destroyed. Now, as we'll see, the Castilians actually freaked out at some level. However, in spite of the prince's order, some of his men went too far. Rui de Pina says during a league that is 5 kilometers. That is basically almost to, it's a lot. It's actually theoretically even beyond the crossing point, which probably it's not, almost up to that point actually. At least if it depends where you think the battle was fought. If it says Pelea Gonzalo here, it's probably up almost to the crossing, and consider that this happened on the Castilian right flank. It's along this ridge, so anyhow it's almost all the way up. In any case, we have no way to measure this specifically. And also they paid the price of this, because if you outstretch, you lose cohesion, you lose sight with your unit, right? And in fact, this the same source, I think, says, and some of the important people and others in the heat of victory chased the fugitives so deeply that they were killed or captured, right? And remember, towards the choke point were other Castilian troops arriving on the spot of battlefield. So they were joining the fight, and these dispersed troops were easy to take down. And according to Rui de Pina, this happened because some of these fugitives, after a hard chase, gathered with one of Ferdinand's battles on the rear, right, and faced the most temerarious pursuers. So this is interesting because it says the Castilians, after all, had even their own reserves. We don't know where these reinforcements were arriving, and some others that had been stationed there. So consider the complexity also of the organic here. Naturally, we have seen also in the Clausewitz and playlist how important it's to have a reserve. Here it doesn't seem that to have been a big deal of them, because it's still important to concentrate the effort all, if the enemy on a line, if the enemy is deployed in the same way, but still having some units or reserves in this way, as we have seen, can turn useful. Also, Pulgar confirms this post-chase episode, because he writes, many of those who were on those 6 Castilian battles defeated by the Prince of Portugal at the beginning, seeing the victory of the other kings' battles in their respective side, it will see now on the left wing and center, assembled with the people of the king and fought again. This is also kind of normal, especially considering, as we will see now, in fact, what happened. And this is possibly also because they were, as we've seen, light horsemen, so they could have run far away and even lure maybe the enemy in this regard in the chase, and eventually regroup and coming back to battle afterwards. And according to this source, this happened 3 hours after the beginning of the battle. So even just think about times and space variables in here, consider what this could have been. Pulgar also justifies the defeat of the Isabellistas with the fact that the prince's battle tagged as a block, while the Castilians were divided into 6 battles, so each of them was successively beaten off without benefiting from the help of the others. This is like, okay, this source states that, but we have no way to see whether it's true or how this actually happened, because, like, it's not that these were imbeciles that went out, in different in different units were knocked out, one by one, and the others weren't just doing anything there. I mean, it's even possible, but the point is, these troops were arranged more or less in a specular way, so they could contrast each other, support each other in a functional way. It's normal that especially skirmishing units are kind of more dynamic, that they don't attack in a compact mass because they want to retreat, to skirmish, go back and forth, feint flights, etc. So, who knows? And another factor cited by the same chronicler says that the great loss suffered by the Castilian was a result of the fire from the many arquebusiers in the Prince's battle. Now, this is more interesting and also kind of more credible. You know that the arquebus is spreading substantially now on the battlefield. The Spanish basically in a generation will become the most advanced combined arms force in Europe, thanks to the interaction of arquebusiers and pikemen. So it's not that here probably there were more or less necessarily than in other European countries, but still we notice the importance of firearms, especially over troops that here seem to have been like mounted skirmishers, like still with javelins, that were still effective at telling the truth, but that now take heavy losses, and they're definitely outranged by the arquebuses that, together with combined with cavalry, are able to to destroy the light cavalry. This is quite interesting because it actually even compensates that relative disadvantage that the Portuguese heavy cavalry could have against more mobile cavalry, so that you basically objectively, you imagine when arquebusiers came for the first time on battlefields in a consistent number and and decent level of training, that objectively their main function was of screening. And if you had skirmishers in front of you, like that evidently weren't equipped in the same way, there were arquebusiers on horseback, but they weren't as common, and it's kind of complicated even to reload, etc. So infantry had the upper hand in this regard. That's the best function, because it definitely annihilates that kind of light cavalry. And this is what, in fact, happens more or less towards the 16th century on Western European battlefields. So Zurita also adds that the prince successfully attacked with such impetus proper that the remaining men of the Castilian army became disturbed, and I would like to see if they had not, because the entire right flank was uncovered now. And these events seemingly had important consequences. The Portuguese chroniclers unanimously state that what Rui de Pina synthesized in this way, quote, King Ferdinand, as soon as he so defeated his first and big battles on the right, and believing the same fate would happen to his own battles at the hands of King Alfonso's battles, was counseled to withdraw as he did to Zamora. Right, so the Portuguese state altogether that Ferdinand, king, king of Castile, because he was already married to Isabel, the future king of Aragon, also would have basically abandoned the battlefield during that. And this is supported, as we will see, also by other evidence later on. And consider that, as we were saying before, that the strategic situation was pretty risky. As we've seen, the Castilians had run after, the same army had besieged them and to confront it in open field. So here was about, what if the king fell or was captured? This would have messed up the entire war, right? The Portuguese might have won, right? The union might have occurred between Portugal and Castile at that point. So this is a time in history in which, the position of the monarch, that is still theoretically, of course, the one of a warrior, of a knight, by definition, but it starts to become a tiny bit more important than pride on the field. If he's taken out an entire state now that starts appearing as so in Europe is going to be deprived of his king, right? So this is an enormous deal. And among the Castilian chroniclers, Pulgar, That is, in fact, the official chronicle of the Reyes Catholicos says that Ferdinand withdrew, in fact, from the battlefield, however, for other reasons. Its justification is, quote, that the king promptly returned to the city of Zamora, it says volvió luego in Spanish, because he was told that the people from the king of Portugal, located in the city of Toro, on the other side of the river, could attack the estancias, so there are these units left besieging the Zamora's fortress. And the cardinal and the Duke of Alba stayed on the battlefield, right, as the commanders-in-chief at that point. So not only Pulgar reveals that Ferdinand left the battle before Cardinal Mendoza and the Duke of Alba, but the expression promptly returned seems to indicate that the king stayed a small time on the battlefield, delegating the leadership on these two main commanders. And on the other hand, was highly improbable that Ferdinand risked to help Zamora in a royal battle which was deciding the destiny of the entire kingdom of Castile. Spot on. And this city wasn't at risk, since it was inconceivable that the small Portuguese garrison of Toro dared to attack in a very dark and rainy night. At this point, the powerful and distant city of Zamora is almost 30 kilometers, but farther through and also farther through the mountains. Instead of helping the forces of his king and prince, which were fighting with difficulties practically at its gates, right? So it's kind of an unlikely explanation. After all, it's a bit to patch up the the retreat of the sovereign from the field. The victorious prince's forces, which as we've seen included the best Portuguese troops, were still on the field and were continuously raising their numbers with dispersed men converging to them from every corner of the field. This is at least what several sources tell. So this reveals a bit of confusion, after all, even among the same Portuguese in some way. That is to say, okay, yes, they were now exploiting this gap that was being formed in the Castilian right, and this is apparently what possibly also naturally scared the king, because if the Castilian army had been at this point outflanked, the entire, as we've seen here, the position of the Castilians was also risky across the ford, right? So this retreat of Ferdinand to Zamora wasn't unjustified overall, right? And it's likely that he abandoned his army, as you saw, the right side shatter as things could get worse, right? It was, after all, a prudent thing to do, and after all, he left his army to continue fighting with competent leadership, right? So this whole situation was naturally all very precarious. As we've seen, this whole march during the whole day, the battle at the end of it, so it was definitely being fought in a situation which probably all two sides could call it off, right? Especially thanks to darkness, as we will see. Now let's pass instead to the other side of the army, how the fight unfolded, because it actually went the other way, right? It's here the Castilians that win, right, and obtaining in proportion also a greater accomplishment, because in the meantime, actually, these two sides began to fight in contemporary, or at least while one or the others had already started to fight. Because it says the other Castilian troops were fighting a fierce combat with their direct opponents. The Castilian center charged the Portuguese center, while the Castilian left wing, superiorly commanded by Cardinal Mendoza and Duke of Alba, as we've seen, this was the best part of the army, attacked the Portuguese right wing. And here, Pulgar writes, those from the battle of the king, that is the Castilian center, as well as those from the left wing, charged respectively against the battle of the king of Portugal and against the other Portuguese of their right wing. Sensing the hesitation of his forces because of the Portuguese attack on the other end of the battlefield, the cardinal rode forward and shouted, "Here is the cardinal, traitors!" He would be wounded but kept fighting with bravery, right? So this important role of the medieval clergy in the politics and in warfare of the time, right? Here he's shouting, presumably to the Castilians that were serving under Portuguese, that is, now we show up as, I show up as Spanish cardinal, which means a lot after, still technically the Reconquista is still going on. There's this enormous this idea that, of course, the monarchy is, especially in Castile, is really a consistent and authoritative power. Castile is the strongest kingdom of Iberia, politically, militarily, constitutionally speaking. So also the clergy has, the high nobility, as we've whether lay or ecclesiastic, has a major importance, and the cardinal represents the power of the church in itself. So you had betrayed a king. Now here I come as a cardinal to, and he fights. He gets wounded. So this is typical of the man of at least the high clergy of the time, were all coming from the most powerful and noble families that were all about warfare. So it didn't really matter what kind of career you took. Like, even popes went to war. So it's not, especially at this time in the Renaissance, things are starting to be also very much more, if you want, more secular. But this was a tradition that, as we know, had already actually had always existed among certain, especially the higher ranks of the clergy. So there is this massive attack on the Portuguese center right from the Castilian center left that causes the Portuguese to break. Right, they started to break. The struggle around the Portuguese royal standard was ferocious, especially, the royal standard, the symbol of the kingdom. If that falls, it's like it's over. So there were the best picked units here to defend the banner, the standard, to the death. And in fact, there is this kind of picturesque episode of Duarte de Almeida. That was the flag carriers proper, who had both hands cut off, right? He first had his hand cut off. This was normal. You find it in many battle accounts that naturally the flags carrier had his hand, which was carrying the standard, cut, and basically he took the banner with the other hand. Also, that hand was cut, right? And therefore he sustained the standard on the air with his teeth, right, until he fainted under the wounds inflicted by the enemies, which surrounded and captured him. As we'll see later, there's all the story of what this Portuguese royal standard, how it ended. Basically, was retaken at some point by the Portuguese, and there is some historiographical myth about it, but seemingly there is no evidence for the Castilians to have finally taken it away from the battlefield. So Alfonso V, the same Portuguese king, seeing his standard lost, and supposing he had equally beaten his son's forces, right, which were smaller than his, sought death in combat. So what does a true king of the 15th century do? The banner is fallen. His son is probably, according to him at least, lost. So he goes on fighting to the death. But he was prevented from doing so by those around him. Once again, the state claims, his own self-preservation, so the king doesn't have to die in here. Because if it would have been disastrous, it would have caused dramatic political consequences. And especially now that you don't know whether even the prince whether he's alive or not. And Alfonso was towed to Castro Nuno, where he was welcomed by the local alcalde. This is traditional Spanish municipal magistrate. By then, the Portuguese disbanded in all directions, and many of them drowned in the Douro River. Right, so this kind of makes sense, as we've seen according to our reconstruction, compared to, the Portuguese right had, the river on its right. So breaking from that side, most of them tend to flee by crossing the river. And many drown because it's dark, it's cold, because of the confusion, right? At this point, the Castilians managed to capture 8 flags and to sack the Portuguese camp, right? Bernal thus painted a grandiose picture of the loot, mentioning many horses, prisoners, gold, silver, and clothes, which was doubtful given that the dark rainy night described by the chroniclers. In fact, Bulgar recognizes that the product of the loot was modest, quote, and the people who participated on the battle during the previous day divided the captured spoils, which were in small quantity, because it was a very dark night. Right, so definitely this battlefield was a total mess. Right, if anything, because you can't see much, right? There are not many lighting systems in the 15th century. When it's dark, point. And you don't know what the enemy can come out from. So this is a dramatic situation in which, naturally, think about just the chain of command. Right, this is a total mess. Pulgar writes, at last the Portuguese saw about the collapse of the Portuguese center and right says, and the Portuguese couldn't stand the mighty force of the Castilians and were defeated, and they ran seeking refuge in the city of Toro. That was at their back, and the Portugal's king, seeing the defeat of his men, gave up of going to Toro to avoid being molested by the men of the king Ferdinand, and with 3 or 4 men of all those who were responsible for his security went to Castro Nuno that night. Consequently, many Portuguese were killed or taken prisoners. Pulgar wrote also that a large number of both Castilians and Portuguese died in the battle, but while the Castilians died fighting, the Portuguese drowned while trying to escape by swimming across the river Douro. Rui de Pina justifies the Portuguese royal battle's defeat with the fact that the best Portuguese troops were with the prince and were missed by the king, and also because there were many arquebusiers in the Castilian royal battle whose fire scared the Portuguese horses. This is very interesting. So you see that the Castilians naturally had their own share of arquebuses. So as we were saying at the beginning, these 2 armies were pretty similar in composition. We don't have to think that after all that they differed a great deal. I personally think it's likely that the arquebusiers, in fact, were most of the troops that existed at the side of the cavalry, because at that point it was the only sensible way for a missile troop to support the cavalry charge. It was typical in many ways. It was used during the 100 Years' War. We were seen many times, so it was evolving during that way. The stopping infantry was in another position, eventually possibly on the rear of the cavalry. And in other units, we don't know, actually. Yeah, I think we don't know. Explicitly, at least. Then, by studying these battles in a compared sense, yeah. But once again, it takes a lot of time. So I promise we will go on checking this stuff. But once again, a more precise studying should answer. And I don't know in my life I will ever have the time to collect all the sources, study all these battles outside of what I already do. In fact, in my work. It's a problem, because this naturally lowers the quality of the analysis, but here we try to do our best even just to point out the problem, because methodologically speaking, that's what matters after all, because that's what the history is about. So with the darkness of the night and the intense rain, chaos reigned. There were dispersed men from all sides, fugitives from the Castilian right wing, Portuguese pursuers, fugitive soldiers from the Portuguese king. The Cardinal Mendoza's men and the Duke of Alba's men were divided between pursuing the Portuguese and sacking their spoils, and still the prince's men returned in the meantime. Right, the battlefield became a very dangerous place where the minimal error could lead to death or imprisonment. As an example, and according to Pulgar, some Portuguese shouted Ferdinand, Ferdinand, to lure their pursuers, making them think they were Castilians. Right, there were certain keywords that were given before the battle, so that especially in cases like this, like with darkness fell, but just imagine there wasn't much of a standardization in uniforms, etc. So what you found in front of you could be as well an enemy, especially when the battlefield had messed itself up. So imagine from one side, the Portuguese have broken, from the other side, the Castilians have broken. So there's a total mess, right? And units going from one side, others from another. And the situation now was very precarious, and now especially for the Portuguese, because naturally at this point the Portuguese had lost most of their army. Right? The Castilians had an advantage now, so everything now was properly in the hands of Alfonso, right? Because he was the only one who had still his troops fundamentally intact, even though he had struggled to rally them and to reorder them and attack them, making them do something. And there wasn't, like, the priority was naturally to rally all the rest of the army if possible. Here also Wikipedia says that as a consequence of this triumph, Ferdinand promptly sent a letter to the cities of Castile claiming victory, but without mentioning neither the defeat part of his forces nor the retreat of his remaining troops when faced with the forces of Prince John, who possessed the capital, also claimed victory. So these are political questions that now we don't treat, but it was done kind of all the time. We know that later the Perfect Prince also sent a letter to the main cities of Portugal, Lisbon and Porto, ordering the commemoration of his triumph on the Battle of Toro, but not mentioning his father's defeat, with a solemn procession on each anniversary of the battle. Right. Also, Isabella immediately ordered a Thanksgiving procession at Tordesillas, and in many other cities, feasts and religious ceremonies were organized to celebrate the great, quote, victory God has given to the king and to our people. She would also build a magnificent commemorative Gothic temple at Toledo, the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes. In fact, it's a beautiful architecture. I've put some picture from it, and this was to dissipate any doubts and perpetuate her victory. So here there is a quote also from Justo Gonzalez, that is a Cuban-American Methodist historian, that writes, both armies faced each other at the camps of Toro, resulting in an undecided battle, but while the Portuguese king reorganized his troops, as we will see now, Ferdinand sent news to all the cities of Castile, to several foreign kingdoms, informing them about a huge victory where the Portuguese were crushed. Faced with this news, the party of La Beltranella, there was one, from the Portuguese queen at this point, was dissolved, and the Portuguese were forced to return to their kingdom. The key of the war was the Castilian public opinion, not the Portuguese. Right? This is very important from a political point of view, because as we've seen since the beginning, eventually now we'll see how the battle unfolded. But here, well, we'll perhaps have to go a bit more in depth to the thing, because as you understand now, the Portuguese center, with some of the finest troops of the kingdom had been wiped out. So, wiped out. Now we'll see. We don't know how many survived, how many died. Maybe there is some study about this, some prosopographical inquiry. This stuff is surely studied, but I don't have the studies here to determine how heavily this weighed on not just on Portugal in terms of domestic policy, but probably on the capacity of Portugal to re-interfere in Castile. Right. So this battle is often said it ended in a stall, in a draw, but fundamentally we may think that on the battlefield the Portuguese lost something more than the Castilians did after all. And the thing that we'll see now, who will remain on the battlefield till the last, is a bit unimportant, if at least compared to the potential that these other elements could have had. And this wouldn't explain otherwise why the Castilians would substantially win the war like this. What would they, just by spreading a fake news that the Portuguese had been defeated in this massive Castilian victory was enough for Castile to reject? This maybe requires further studying, but once again, it's not part of our tactical analysis. And let's in fact see what happened afterwards, because that's possibly at least the most interesting part of the battle, in a way. Even a bit the most mysterious, but still something that gives you an idea of the total mess that this battle turned into, because meanwhile, Prince John returned after the brief chase, defeating one of the Castilian battles where the men were dispersed looting the spoils of defeated Portuguese. So he comes back and he finds some Castilians that have, gone forth, and they are starting looting the Portuguese camp. And he defeats them, like one batalla. So here it's basically a company, as far as I understand, in this context. So not one like the entire center, presumably, because that's what he found more clearly next to him. But probably also the situation was a bit more chaotic here to make these rationalizing statements. But however, faced with other enemy battles, he abstained from attacking and put his men in a defensive position on a hill. Right. So here we can't be. So as we understand, there were other battles that arrived, and consider that. We don't know how much cohesion naturally these units had maintained. Evidently, one was looting, didn't have preserved any, because they had spread looting and they weren't lined up in a formation in the ranks, etc. The others might have been actually ready for battle, and this is something sensible to do, unless you think at all the times that units, undisciplined units, simply broke and began to loot independently from their commanders. But here there is, at least as we have seen, not much of a. This wasn't a moment to kid around, in spite of the success had been achieved. And if you look at this battlefield, there is no hill, but these ridges towards the south side. So from the Portuguese side, actually on the left one, so the one from which the same Prince John actually was. So it kind of makes sense that John comes back from the chase, always in this kind of west-east axis, and he finds the disaster, and the first place he wants to hold, right? He doesn't flee. He would have fled at that point. He decides to resist, but he wants at least to rally the fugitives around a stronger position. And this is a hill, and the hills begin towards the south, right, on the left side of the Portuguese. And this is probably what most, at least the Portuguese from the center division, one of the king, probably were also trying to flee to, right? Because you have different options. One is the river on the right, which, it's not in winter at night, it's not such a great option. Then there is all this in the rear, this flat land, which you can't be pursued. Then you have on the left these mountains. They're fairly close, and you can't theoretically hide into. At least there were bushes, something, trees, etc. So, and especially that's where you see that probably the sea. We don't know, because between the fog and the darkness, we don't know what the thing really was at that point. But we know, in fact, as we will see, that the prince began to light up some fires, so to be recognized evidently, and to evidence a rally point by him. And that's where you see that probably there is sound view, and you gather, right? So to reacquire cohesion at that point, and considering that the night is equal for both of the contendants, even the Castilians here are not fully certain they have won, right? They know they have accomplished a big deal, but kind of everybody knew that in that darkness, everything was theoretically still up, right, as a possibility. So as we were saying, Prince John lighted big fires and played the trumpets to guide all the Portuguese spread throughout the camp towards him and to defy the enemy. He acted this way because, according to the chronicler Álvaro Chaves, the prince's forces were undernumbered, as most of his men had gone in pursuit of the adversaries. Right? Quote, the prince turned against the battles of King Ferdinand, but because the people from his battles spread in the pursuit of the defeated, the enemy's battle outnumbered the few men that remained with him, but in spite of that he attacked and defeated it, and he went on until he faced other enemy battles, and then he stopped his battle to recover some of these dispersed men, because the enemy had tried all of his people. Kind of makes a lot of sense. Considering the numerical ratios, what had gone on, right? You have basically less 1/3 of the Portuguese army facing basically 2/3 of the Castilian army. Pulgar writes, and because the people of his father and king were defeated and dispersed, the Prince of Portugal went up to a hill, and played the trumpets and lighted fires in order to recover some of the fugitives, and stood on with his battle. So there is a cohesion of his own unit after all, in spite of those who have spread out to chase the enemy. And the prince's men took some prisoners, among them King Ferdinand's uncle, Enrique, Count of Alba de Liste, and for his great joy he retook his father's royal standard, as well as the Castilian noble who carried it, Sotomayor, according to the chroniclers Rui de Pina, Garcia de Rezende, Damião de Gois. Okay, so there is this, kind of ransoming of the Portuguese honor that they managed to retake the standard. They even captured the Count of Alba, right? So this is fascinating, by the way, because as we've seen, the Count of Alba was actually in the left wing. So here the situation has gotten really mixed and confused in a way that's difficult for us to see. Also, with the prince's forces increasing continuously, because this is what most of the sources now begin to state, like the fact that after all the Portuguese now were rallying towards these fires, towards the trumpet, said, that's a rally point. Let's go there because that's easier to escape in the darkness anywhere else, right? No military leader could be considered winner without defeating this new threat, which included the Portuguese elite troops, by the way, because as we've seen, the prince had the finest Portuguese cavalry, who had defeated the Castilian right wing. Zurita writes, this could have been a very costly victory if the Prince of Portugal, who always had his forces in good order and was very near the river banks, had attacked our men who were dispersed and without order. The Cardinal Mendoza and the Duke of Alba began to join. Excuse me. There is a difference between the Count of Alba de Liste and the Duke of Alba. So my mistake that he wasn't the same person. But anyhow, right? Ferdinand's uncle. So that's still hell of a prisoner. But this is important because actually it's the picture gets more coherent. Like Mendoza and the Duke of Alba on the left wing were still at their place, right? So this is my bad. That clarifies the account, so it's fine. So the two Castilian commanders began to join their dispersed men to remove the new threat, right? So now they say, what the hell? These guys are regrouping. We must go against them and striking them. The problem now is that they had consistent problems at the level of coordination of the troops. Pulgar writes, against the Prince John, the Spain's cardinal, as well as the Duke of Alba, intended to go with some men that were able to collect from those returned from the chase. So a consistent number of Castilians had gone chasing, so that they're out of their orders. They are even tired, right? After the battle, think about all the situation. You have fought, you have chased the enemy. It's night, in winter, it's cold. It's a freaking mess. You're exhausted, right? And also from those who were spread around the camp, capturing horses and prisoners. So this is the Castilian force now is not like the fresh, orderly one of the one of the beginning of the battle. It's something different, and therefore it's difficult to attack orderly, and to crush actually the Portuguese were regrouping. This is an important problem because you see, if the Castilians had been well ordered, the Prince of Portugal would have not stood a chance. Right? It doesn't matter how many, that he had his finest under his command, still allegedly orderly, because they had also fought and come back. So yeah, they probably maintained cohesion, but there's no comparison between, let's say, the employment of our reserve at that point. Remember the importance of reserve. That could have not been used on a large scale now during the battle, which required the well commitment that could serve to stop some Portuguese pursuer on the Castilian right, as we've seen in the bottom of the field, but not now to the rest of the forces had already been joined and spent in a way. So this creates properly the standstill, creates properly the draw. because now two great heterogeneous battles, a Portuguese and a Castilian one, formed this way, standing face to face and playing musical instruments to intimidate each other. Quote, so close were the men from one part and the other that some knights went out for the battles to invest with their spears. This is from Alvaro Lopez. So here you find even individual fighters that go out there and kill who they find, right? Even in small pockets or even individually, literally, right? So one of those situations in which just think about all the of the forces, all of the fatigue, the hatred, the rage, of all the movements during the battle, all the anxiety that had to be vented, the fact, the battle had been brutal. People were all, kind of nervous in a way or another, were shaken by what had happened and all this stuff. So you're having this kind of irrationale that at some points takes over, especially with the darkness feeling. You can imagine the feelings. I mean, you can't really, but we can't imagine what this might have been. But it's difficult now to maintain a proper cohesion. After all, and it's still vital for, at this point in the darkness, to do something about the whole situation. In fact, the Cardinal and the Duke of Alba couldn't convince their men to move and attack the prince's forces. This is also a problem, in fact, as they couldn't join and move the men. That's corroborated by the Portuguese chronicle Garcia de Rezende, who says, being very close to him, the prince, so many men of the King Ferdinand, they didn't dare to attack him because they had seen his men fighting so bravely and observed the security of order of his forces. Right. So it is true that the Portuguese elite, at least, was still cohesive and ordered, right? And that's what an elite for, right? You launch a charge, even more than one. You still have the training, the resilience to redeploy orderly. This is something that unskilled troops cannot have, right? That's what the difference makes on the battlefield. So those units really saved the Portuguese from a true defeat. That point, in a devastating one. Pulgar felt the necessity to justify the fact that the Castilians, which assumed the victory, didn't attack the victorious prince and have instead retreated to Zamora, as they would. Quote, because the night was so dark, the Castilians could neither see nor recognize each other, and because the men were so tired and haven't eaten all day, as they left Zamora by morning and turned back to the city of Zamora. Think about this as well. Right? You're exhausted. You need to eat. With your gear on, it's cold outside. You burn energies. You made this 30 kilometers. Almost, at least. You have fought for hours. You think about the tension, the fear. You're scared as hell. You haven't even eaten. You don't have enough calories to go on. How would you convince... So... This is actually, as a justification, very realistic, and also the visibility has a lot of importance in here, because during night all the uncertainties are amplified. You can't see much, and you don't know what's going on, and the situation is difficult. So these circumstances, which apply to the enemies as well, however, don't explain the Castilian behavior, because the chronicles of both sides show that the prince's battle kept increasing, making, quote, a gross battle, because towards it moved many defeated and fugitives from the royal battle, right, so the central one. So this justifies, naturally, that most of the Portuguese center had shifted towards at least the mountains, where it was seen on the left, where they're seen the fires and heard the trumpets of the prince's men, and also the prince's men coming back from the enemy's chase, and even contingents of soldiers from Toro, which crossed the battlefield to reinforce the prince. Thus, if all these men could reach the prince, the Castilian could do it too, especially because the two battles, the Portuguese and the Castilian, were so proximal that the men could listen to each other, quote, being so close to each, the Portuguese to the Castilians, that they could hear what they talked about, Garcia de Rezende, right? And here I would be a bit more, lenient towards the Castilians, because, like, we can't imagine what this battle had been now, right? We don't have enough information to say, now the Castilians could easily regroup just as the Portuguese were doing. We don't even know how many Portuguese actually rallied. I mean, numerically speaking, yes, the chronicles can say that, but the chronicles can be saying that and that's it. But do we have any other evidence quantifying we don't really know, right? Grossly speaking, we can say, okay, well, but the Castilians had like 2/3 of their armies ideally enforced. Yes, okay, but what do we know about terrain? What do we know about the morale? What do we know about what the two sides actually knew about what had happened? Right? We don't know that. As far as we're concerned, they might have actually not even clearly know what had occurred from their respective sides at that point, and that's a problem. Even just decisionally speaking, and the troops are tired, right? So I actually think that this was a great deal in the first place for the Castilians to accomplish, right, up to that point. I can say that this article is a bit biased in favor of the Portuguese, but let's say that he points out very clearly all the things that want to show the fact that the Portuguese, after all, were able to regroup. They were the last to retreat from the battlefield. Yes, it's all true, right? But we don't clearly know, not even from the Castilian side, what was going on after all, right? And we know, however, that the Castilians withdrew in disorder to Zamora. At least several sources say this, right? Read Opinion says, and being the two enemy battles face to face, the Castilian battle was deeply agitated and showing clear signs of defeat if attack as it was without king and dubious of the outcome. Definitely the flight of the king wasn't like the best thing ever for them. The quote goes on, says, and without discipline and with great disorder they went to Zamora. So being the prince alone on the field without suffering defeat but inflicting it on the adversary, he became heir and master of his own victory. Naturally, this is a Portuguese source. So, okay, let's try. We don't have to take chroniclers for, especially at this time, for objective sources. Like, we don't care to even whether they are, right? What we care about is the plausibility of the wall, how this information is provided, what they actually say, right? So it's definitely possible the Castilians at this point were exhausted. They had to come back, right? For whichever reason. Damião de Goes said, being the night so advanced, the Castilians left the camp in small groups, and neither the Cardinal of Castile nor the Duke of Alba could impose them order. They also went to Zamora with the men who remained with them in the most silent way as possible, as all the people had fled, and the prince, realizing their retreat, didn't pursue them, because he feared that the Castilian retreat was a war trap, but that wasn't the intention of the Castilians, because by morning not a soul was seen on the field, resulting in a victorious prince with all his people in order. Álvaro de Chaves, they abruptly left the camp towards Zamora as defeated men, even says. Garcia de Resente says, and after the prince had been most of the night on the battlefield and seeing that the enemy had fled, leaving no soul behind, and having nothing more to do, he decided to stand in the camp for 3 days. He would be convinced by Toledo's archbishop to stay there only 3 hours as a symbol of 3 days. So after defeating their direct opponents because of the dark of the rainy night, Prince John's tactical choice had been to prevent the dissemination of his forces during the subsequent chase, slowly gathering the scattered men from all provinces in order to recover his lost operational power and attack the Castilians early next day. Right? This is at least what Goes states, and so this is important naturally because this is more than just like a plan to make it the next day, because it's already an enormous deal that the Prince of Portugal managed to rally his troops with 2/3 of his army lost. Right, this is really an enormous deal. So what the Castilians did here was, from their side, another enormous accomplishment, but they had spent all their forces there retreated. Basically, the Portuguese prince managed to rally and to wait for the morning and to realize that the Castilians had gone away. Right, so what happened during the night, we can't just guess. Like, the troops, the Castilians retreated, as we have seen. Their commanders couldn't basically control them at that point because they were presumably exhausted, and we have no reason to think otherwise. And this is how the battle went. And if you look at it in perspective, objectively, the Portuguese lost much more the Castilians did. It's not the Portuguese, for example, chased the Castilians. It happened just with the Jinetes on the right, but on the Castilian right. But the rest of the Portuguese army, saying king was taken out of the field. It was a dramatic engagement. The Portuguese lost 2/3 of their fighting force during combat because they fled, right? So this is also particularly poignant as a view. So eventually the battle ended. Like the prince made a triumphal march towards Toro, carrying his Castilian prisoners he had taken, and with his flags draping at the sound of trumpets. But very soon the sadness dominated him because nobody knew where his father, the king, was. Right. Besides that, the city of Toro was chaotic, with its gates closed because the Portuguese mistrusted their Castilian allies, who they accused of treason and blamed for defeat of their king, and the prince ordered the gates to be opened, restored the order, and on the next day he sent a force to Castro Nuño, which brought back the king. Right? He also, quote, sent some of his captains to the battlefield to bury the dead and to redact the victory, which was entirely made without contradiction. So the fact that the Portuguese remained masters of the battlefield is documented in contemporary sources from both sides. Bulgar first states that the King Ferdinand withdrew from the battlefield to Zamora because Cardinal Mendoza and the Duke of Alba, and then he declares that his army, now under command of the Cardinal and Duke, also withdrew from the Battle of Zamora, and after an attempt to attack Prince John, was thus left in possession of the battlefield. Bernaldez explicitly wrote that the prince only returned to Toro after the withdrawal of Ferdinand's army. The people of King Ferdinand, both horsemen and infantry, plundered the camp and all the spoils they found in front of the Prince of Portugal, who during that night never moved from a top of a hill until King Ferdinand left to Zamora with his people plus the spoils. Then the Prince of Portugal left to Toro. Juan de Mariana corroborates him, quote, that the enemy led by Prince John of Portugal, who without suffering defeat stood on a hill with its forces in good order until very late. Thus both forces, Castilians and Portuguese, remained face to face for some hours, and the Portuguese kept their position during more time. This is actually, I must say, objective. After all, I mean the article is not biased at all, but it's important to stress also. In fact, what this article lacks fundamentally is the whole, like, how the analysis of the approaching maneuver. That this, you see how this thing is done. It's done just by quoting the chronicles about what, in fact, they state, but not much kind of reconnecting the whole strategic logic of how the two armies had got into that place. What could be the moral forces involved in that, in those strategic intentions, right? This is very important in the process of the same tactical analysis, because as we have seen, that tactics and strategy are constantly connected, interfering with one another, right? So this article is actually well written, right? However, for example, it doesn't talk much about the battlefield at all, which should be. Right. So to resume a little bit here, they wrote this thing about the balance after all this battle, and it's written: the Portuguese chronicles agree with the Castilian official Chronicle Pulgar most of the essential facts about the Battle of Toro. Both showed that the strongest part of each army, the Castilian and Portuguese left wings, respectively led by Cardinal Mendoza and Prince John, never fought each other. Only at the end, says Pulgar, there was an unsuccessful attempt of Cardinal Mendoza and Duke of Alba to attack the forces of the prince, quickly followed by a withdrawal of the Castilian army to Zamora. This was probably decisive for the final outcome of the battle, because each one of the armies won where it was stronger. Naturally, the Castilian and Portuguese chroniclers focused their attention on their respective victory. So here there is a list of, facts, we can say. The first one, each side had a party of its army defeated and one part winner. True, albeit there was an asymmetry between the two. The Castilian army had its right wing defeated and its left center winner. Portuguese army had its right center defeated and its left wing victorious. 2. Both kings left the battlefield. Ferdinand to Zamora in an orderly way, probably after the victorious attack of the prince, and Alfonso V fled after the defeat of his royal battle by the Castilian left center. The battlefield stood in possession of the prince's forces, increased by many combatants spread throughout the camp, which converged to him as a tactical victory. The Portuguese royal standard was taken by the prince's men. It was retaken, as we'll see now in a while, also more in detail. The losses were The losses were large in both armies in relative terms, but small in absolute value. Here I don't know actually about the... I will see the losses later. Now, both sides proclaimed victory. The battle represented a victory for the aspirations of Isabel to the throne of Castile, regardless its uncertain military outcome. Going to the losses that now we just mentioned, we didn't talk about because they here split the thing. It says the total number of losses, dead and prisoners, was probably similar to both armies, but larger among the Juanistas. Yeah, this is correct, right? We've seen predictably that this would be the case, even without reading properly this, the numbers. And wouldn't have been higher than 1,000 men among the Portuguese Castilians, many hundreds for the Isabellistas. Right, so Portuguese losses were presumably high, however, right. While Diego de Valera estimates 800 dead, Bernaldez mentions about 1,200 Portuguese dead. And that's which is a lot actually, if we talk just about that. That's a version. High Portuguese losses and low Castilian losses, right? So it's kind of one of the extremes. But a version of the great Portuguese losses / great Castilian losses is much more credible. Not only because it's only one supported by the sources of both sides, Pulgar and Lopez de Chavez, but also because Bernaldez is contradicted by no less than 6 chroniclers, 3 Castilian and 3 Portuguese, who explicitly stated that the Castilian losses were high. Pulgar, Esteban de Garibay y Zamaloa, Pedro de Medina, Garcia de Rezende, Lopez Chavez, and Damião de Gois. Right, so, yeah, you can't believe that. And Pulgar states, and many were killed in one side and on another side. So, this, for example, is a typical way of phrasing the thing without being too specific, after all. Alvaro Lopez de Chavez was also an eyewitness of the battle, of the campaign, adds, and on the battle there were many dead, prisoners and wounded on one side and on the other side. So these are kind of relatively low amount of information about the numbers proper. But this seems to be, however, I don't know, if they had other numbers they might have put it in here, but it seems reasonable that objectively the Portuguese suffered more. Right? It's realistic. After all, as the same article acknowledges. Talking about prisoners, the available numbers are even scarcer. The chronicler Palencia wrote that when Alfonso V returned to the city of Toro in the days immediately after the battle, he had wasted an opportunity stabbing or throwing in the river 500 enemies, both infantry and cavalry. These were Castilian prisoners inside Toro, which would certainly be a revenge over men who had contributed to his defeat in the battle. Like all numbers related to the Battle of Toro, there are no certainties, and this number of 500 Castilian prisoners should be considered as a maximum and possibly inflated. Fair judgment here. The losses were relatively large compared to the size of the armies in presence, but according to chronicler Juan de Mariana, they were low in terms of absolute value. For a battle with its political importance, the killing was small compared with the victory, and even the number of captives was not large. Besides the chroniclers, there is an additional evidence pointing to low losses in the Battle of Toro. During the Lisbon Course of 1476, the procurators of Évora called the attention of Prince John to the strong contingent given by the city to his father's army. This was natural because Évora was the second most popular Portuguese city of the 15th century. What is not expectable is that only 17 men from that contingent had died in the Battle of Toro, as the same procurators proudly declared. This number only makes sense if we accept that Portuguese fatalities in the battle were low. Yeah, this is an interesting datum, but, taken by itself, we don't clearly know, for example, where these troops were practically stationed, for example. Because if they had been just, for example, in the left wing, they might have been just a reserve of the prince that was maybe more spared. We don't know. We don't know after all. It would be interesting to know if there are kind of similar data about this. Then here there is other interesting information about the recovery of the Portuguese royal standard, which all data suggests that it was retaken by the Portuguese on the field after it was lost, as we've seen before, with Duarte de Almeida having, defended it almost to the. I don't know if he died eventually from the wound that received, but here it says the Portuguese chroniclers unanimously state the Portuguese royal standards were retaken from the enemy by Gonçalo Pires, whose nickname became Bandeira. In fact, in Portuguese it means flag, in memory of that deed, and so he became Gonçalo Pires Bandeira, coat of arms chart concealed on July the 4th, 1483 by King John II. This is how, just heraldic symbols happen. So King John II is naturally, as we've seen, the prince in this battle. And the Castilian book Heritage, Sotomayor, was captured and the others fled. So the Portuguese chronicler Rui da Pina made a hard critic to the king himself. He accuses Afonso V of ingratitude towards Gonçalo Pires, the man who served him so well and retook the standard. The royal rent given to him was so miserable, 5,000 reis, that he had to work in agriculture in order to survive. The manual work as a stigma of the medieval mentality. This was certainly common knowledge, because other way it would be gratuitous slander to the king Alfonso V, uncle of the monarch Manuel I, to whom Rui de Pina wrote his chronicle, from which his author wouldn't benefit at all. Most of the Castilian chronicles also confirm the fact that Castilians lost the Portuguese standard during the battle. However, the Castilian sources are contradictory in details. In one of their chroniclers, Bernaldez even wrote that the Portuguese ensign was killed, whereas he was captured and later returned to Portugal. In his chronicle, Pulgar, the official chronicle of the Catholic monarchs, made an important correction to a previous account that he had provided a few years ago in a letter sent to the city of Murcia, pretending that after the battle the Castilians owned half of the Portuguese royal standards, after two Castilian knights had divided it in two pieces, one of them lost in part. Then a reward would have been announced, and some time later a man with the other half would have appeared, and the two halves formed the wall again. However, it is very implausible that the two men dared to tear apart in two halves such a precious trophy, whose care had been entrusted by them by Cardinal Mendoza himself. Indeed, a few years later, after investigating the episode and many other facts, in order to write his chronicle of the reign of the Catholic monarchs, Pulgar reviewed this first version and eventually stated plainly that Ferdinand's men simply lost the Portuguese royal standard in the Battle of Toro, thus converging his own report with that of the Portuguese chroniclers and increasing its reliability, since it included an embarrassing fact, quote, "And the standard of the King of Portugal was taken there by the Cardinal and by the men of arms of his guard. And the Cardinal left that place and ordered two kings, Pedro de Velasco and Pedro Vaca, to guard the standard, but they lost it again, and 8 flags were taken to the Portuguese, which were taken to the city of Zamora, and the ensign that brought the standard of the King of Portugal was arrested and was taken to Zamora." Hernando del Pulgar, Crónica de los Reyes Católicos. However, other trophies were involved. In 1922, several academics, from them Félix de Llanos y Torrillas, studied a Portuguese banner hanging at the chapel of the New Kings in Toledo's cathedral, and concluded that this banner was probably Castilian and probably from the 14th century. In 1945, Orestes Ferrara also investigated the banner and concluded that it couldn't be the standard carried by Alfonso V at Battle of Toro. It is necessary to take into account that several Portuguese banners were captured in the battle. 8, according to Pulgar. Among them, according to Palencia, was the minor Portuguese royal standard, as traditionally used by the kings of Castile, which Alfonso V assumed to be and that may have been mistaken by some Castilians as the main Portuguese standard. This is interesting. In their writings, both chroniclers Pulgar and Palencia, as well as Ferdinand himself, clearly differentiate the Portuguese royal standard from the Portuguese flags. The loss of the Portuguese royal standard can also be demonstrated by its absence. Writing during the last year of the war, de Isabella's partisan Baquilar Palma describes in detail as an eyewitness the triumph ceremony of the Cathedral of Toledo on February 2, 1477, only 11 months after the battle, during which the most valuable trophies taken to the Portuguese were dragged to the ground and then hung over the tomb of King John I, whose memory of Castile, whose memory was thus symbolically avenged since he had lost the Castilian royal standard to the Portuguese in the Battle of Aljubarrota, right in 1385. So that was something that the Castilians were taking revenge from. And only the armor of the Portuguese alferez and several flags taken to Alfonso V were there, but the Portuguese standard is not mentioned. So that would have been quite of a feat. So it's quite clearly evident that the Castilians actually didn't bring back the main Portuguese standard from the battlefield. But it is true, as the same Portuguese chronicles state, that there is enough evidence for this, that they had lost it initially, and they had regained that, however. Here it also says, thereby Isabella conceived the remaining fallback solution, an invasion of Portugal led by herself in order to retake Castilian royal standard lost to the Portuguese at Battle of Aljubarrota, the plan which was considered inappropriate to her feminine condition by Chronicle Palencia, which involved numerous troops from many cities. 1477 was soon abandoned. In addition to the Portuguese chronicles, 3 Castilian chronicles corroborate the episode of the recapture of the Portuguese standard, which is thus supported by contemporaneous sources on both sides. Scholar Antonio de Nebrija, was a Castilian, says that the Lusitanian standard is captured, which was a valuable insignia, yet by the negligence of Pedro Velasco and Pedro Vaca, to whom it was entrusted, as already mentioned, it is subsequently taken up by the enemy. Chronicle Garibay, Spanish, says the King of Portugal, seeing lost one first time his royal standard and captured the ensign, was taken to Zamora and stripped of his weapons, which were exposed in the chapel of the New Kings, Toledo's church, even though the standard for negligence was taken by the Portuguese. Royal cosmographer and chronicler Pedro de Medina, Castilian, said the Castilians invested the Portugal standard and took it easily due to the cowardly and soft resistance from the ensign and its guards. The ensign was captured and later taken back to Zamora, but the standard was not taken because some Portuguese knights regained it after fighting with bravery. So let's conclude it here, because this is basically what the battle is about. Here there is actually a lot of other information. This is the very first time we used Wikipedia as text of reference for describing this battle, because it has an unusually well-informed page regarding to the battle, with all these quotes from chroniclers, from scholars, so it's very spot on. The person who wrote this was very good at his or her job, and fine. You know, if all Wikipedia articles were like this, we would definitely end. I must say that English Wikipedia, generally speaking, is well sourced, but it rarely brings like the full sources, right? You know, the full quotes. This is very good. It was very interesting, in fact, to study the battle from here. Naturally, as we were saying before, this is not how you should do it. If you want to do a serious thing, you should always take all the various sources, all of them, all of them, and all the historiography existing in general, all the studies, etc., and study them and take a good map and starting to play around with that and to study the battle for what it was, right? And we've tried to do a bit of that with the map, etc. That's perhaps the only thing it is lacking in this article. A bit more circumstantial information about the battlefield proper, which I presume we don't know much about, but that at least should be pointed out a bit, especially the strategical context, like why the troops have moved like this. A bit more of speculation, even, just if you want, but still to say, who had the stronger, like, who had a greater motivation, what did this armies meet for there specifically after the end of the siege of Samar, etc. So, but for the rest, we're more than satisfied, after all, for what we're doing here, at least. And so I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.